Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to FS 201. We'll start with some announcements. Your first your pack back question and responses are due today, Friday, April 3rd by 11:59 p.m. And QuizM 11 will open today and close on April 8th. So be sure you get those things in. We ended up last time talking about a timeline of food law and what those laws meant to food and what they were specifically targeting. So we've saved the best for last. We're now going to be talking about the most recent food law, Food Safety Modernization Act. Now remember that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was really the first big law for food relating to safety, adulteration, all of those types of concerns. So that was the first instance of encompassing food law. Now this in 2011, so we had our first one in 1938, and in 2011, this is the next big overhaul of the food system and laws relating to it. And of course, here from the name, you can tell that it's all about food safety and bringing food safety up to date, making sure that we're targeting things with new technology that we have and understanding the new types of hazards or the revealed hazards that have always been there, but now we really know about them because of modern science. So the Food Safety Modernization Act is abbreviated as FSMA, or the FSMA law. It is the most sweeping change in food since 1938. And really what we're doing is switching from a reactive standpoint of, oh, someone got sick, we need to recall this food product, to a more proactive, preventative outlook for this law, meaning that, oh, we think there may be a problem with it because some of our controls in our system have shown us that something was compromised along the way. It also helps to allow us to be more flexible and adaptive so that we can adjust for new and emerging concerns, as well as taking something that doesn't work in our current safety plan and adjusting it for our food production. So definitely shifting the focus from responding to foodborne illness to preventing it. So our main FSMA themes for this law are prevention, inspection, compliance, and response. So making sure that that the law is being obeyed and putting those laws into place. How do we inspect food manufacturers, ingredient suppliers for those things? And then what is the response going to be to that? And then because our world is more global, and we're definitely highlighting that in this current day and time, of the global nature of our world, our food supply, all of our products, this law focuses on import safety as well. And with that import safety, we're really looking at enhancing partnerships with other countries, within our own country, and inspectors. This law had a lot of new enforcement that needed to take place. So when we look at the FSMA approach to preventing foodborne illness, what we start with is identification of hazards in our sequence or system of food manufacturing, production, distribution, wherever we are in this timeline or continuum of farm to table, we're identifying hazards associated with those steps. We need to make sure that we understand the cause of those hazards. Are we not heat treating our food like with romaine lettuce? Is this a cause for concern? And if it is, then how are we addressing it in other ways? The next step, once we know the hazard and we understand it, and the cause of it, we're going to implement some type of preventative control. So we have to do something that helps reduce the risk, right? And that's our preventative control. Once we know what that thing is, whether it be testing for a certain type of bacteria or foodborne pathogen at a certain time, making sure there's no metal in a food product. Sometimes metal pieces fall off equipment, so it's important to make sure that that's not there. Same thing with plastics. So whether it be some physical hazard, some microbiological hazard, maybe it's a chemical chemical hazard, like the aflatoxin that's produced in peanuts. Maybe we need to make sure that that's not getting in our food. Whatever that hazard is, we're going to implement some type of preventative control, whether it be testing or some way to decrease its likelihood. Monitoring that effectiveness. Are we actually decreasing the risk of that hazard? And if not, then we need to be reviewing our schematic and what we're doing and adjusting for that. So this is a very cyclical process. It's not a once and done. You make a plan and it's all good. This is a process that is reviewed continually and adjustments are made when necessary. And this should look a little bit familiar to everybody, especially if you are in a science background. This idea of a continuum of cyclical nature of identifying a problem, doing some research about it, understanding what's going on, testing for it, getting some results, reviewing those results, and then re-examining this whole process again is definitely the scientific method, but it's just being applied to food safety. So reviewing, identifying, understanding, reviewing all of these things and making adjustments, this is an iterative process. We have the first iteration, which if you've ever done research, you know, you do an experiment and you get some results, you answer a question, and it just triggers more questions, right? So definitely a cyclical process where we are honing in and getting better and better every time. That's the goal. And with food safety, that's important. This is definitely, you can see from the sequence, more preventative rather than reactionary. But when this law was passed, there's a whole lot of politics that goes along with it, right? There's a whole lot of logistics that have to be in place in order for laws, once they're passed, to really be enacted and acted upon. So when FSMA was passed in 2011, there were lots of issues, and you see this first hurdle here in this cartoon is funding. How are we going to implement this law, all the inspections that need to take place, all the paperwork that needs to be maintained? How are we going to do all the testing we need to do without any money? And so funding was important. And then we needed to really understand who was going to be using this law, how to best implement trainings. There was no one to train people how to implement this particular process in their food processing plant, to report it, to understand preventative controls. There was just a whole lot of details that needed to be worked out once this law was passed. And there were some definite reasons for passing this law. Right? Remember our numbers. We have 48 million that get sick with foodborne illness every year in the United States alone. 128,000 of those 48 million need hospitalization to get through the illness, and 3,000 of those don't get through the illness. So we've got good reason to pass a new law to try to address food safety in a more proactive type of function. The law that was previously in place, that 1938 FD&C Law Act, was not the best for preventative measures. It was really okay for reactionary, but with our global food supply growing and greater distribution possible than there was in 1938, we needed a new law to address all of these foodborne illnesses that we know about and to decrease the death rate associated with them. So FSMA was passed, but not the best funding. So it was passed without sufficient funding really to enact it and make it go forward. So how does the FDA plan to implement it, and what have they done with it? So there were several challenges associated with FSMA. One was the inspection of food in the U.S. In order to make sure that we have proper inspections, we have to have the correct number of inspectors. They have to be trained in this new law, what to look for, the type of documentation that's required in association with FSMA. So all of those things had to take place. That training They had to develop the class in order to get that training and certification. They had to implement it across the United States. Not only did they have to do this across the United States, but now this FSMA law was requiring international inspections. So we needed to inspect places that were producing food and food ingredients that were coming into the US. So a foreign supplier verification program was put into place. This is a huge undertaking, making sure that those inspectors in other countries are certified in exactly what the FSMA law requires and needs to be put into place and to be upheld. And then once that is done, then when that product is imported, are there further inspections that occur in the US? What documentation needs to be presented? Who keeps records of those documentations? There's a lot of logistics to this that had to be developed and implemented. So, what's the difference between what was previously in place, more specifically, and now? So, previously, safety plans called HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, were in place. Now, these HACCP plans was sparked in 1993 from a foodborne illness outbreak of E. coli 0157H7 at a Jack in the Box fast food hamburger restaurant. Hamburgers were undercooked and were contaminated with this E. coli pathogenic strain. And so many people were sickened by this. And so the plan put into place in order to reduce the risk of foodborne illness was called HACCP. And it might sound familiar to the process that is used in FSMA. They look at a hazard, they analyze it, they figure out some critical control point that they're going to look at this particular measure and make sure, or this measure is going to make sure that we are preventing the hazard, right? This plan was implemented by the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and the FSIS, Food Safety Inspection Service program, implemented specifically for meat and eggs. So anytime you see the USDA is going to be regulating animal products, eggs, dairy, meats, any of those types of things. The FDA regulates the majority of other food products. So HACCP was primarily targeted towards meat and eggs, and then was implemented in other industries. Excuse me. Now, what we're looking at is the hazard analysis and risk-based preventative control measures. So what we were doing before is just looking at a hazard and measuring something and then using that to say yay or nay. Now we're really looking to look at a hazard, implement preventative measures for that, not just measure it and see if it's there, but implement preventative measures in order to control it. So the challenges in the United States were inspections of food in the United States, international inspections of food coming to the United States, and because we have these two sort of arms, that one is very close to home nationally and then the other is internationally across the world, we had to figure out how to train everyone the same way. Everyone has to be operating with the same playbook, the same rules. We don't want the rules to be less effective or more stringent for those that are importing foods or ingredients than for those here in the United States. And so, as you know, and as you've seen with this corona outbreak and how it's been addressed, there are three different levels of government pertaining to FSMA that are being implemented. The federal level, which is the national level, the state level, which is addressing each of the 50 states by itself, and then further down from that, there's the county level. So the federal level is the United States. The state level for North Carolina is North Carolina, and then the county level for us here in Raleigh is Wake County. So we have these three different levels of state government. They all have to talk to each other. They all have to be on the same set of rules and how to implement things. And that's where extension programs at NC State came into play. Two different extension coordinators were hired in order to help implement FSMA. So two full-time positions were put into place at NC State in the food science department specifically to address the laws and regulations for FSMA. Now consider that you are a small farmer. You produce foods that are sold at farmers markets and maybe one or two grocery stores, specialty stores. It's a very different process to implement FSMA, the law, in your business than if someone like General Mills was going to implement FSMA. General Mills has a whole department of people that are devoted to understanding regulatory law and implementing it within the company. This small farmer probably just has himself or herself that is dealing with trying to understand this massive change in the laws regarding food safety and what's going to happen. So there was some strategic deployments put into this particular law, and that larger companies had to comply in a more short-term basis, where smaller companies had a bit more time to understand the law and implement it. So these two folks that were hired on at NC State in Extension, which is the mission of Extension, is to take research that's done at universities and help farmers or smaller food businesses, as far as food science goes, understand that research and implement it in their daily process. And this is definitely not necessarily research, but it's a major change to the food processing and food manufacturing environment. And so those extension agents were hired to help the companies in North Carolina, big or small, to understand what the change was, how they were going to address it, and how what programs were in place to help them address it, that they weren't all on their own. So these two extension agents, whose names are Lynette Johnson and Curry Noble, Lynette and Curry developed training programs for different industries. So fresh produce, this was the first law that addressed fresh produce. Previously, there was not as much regulatory law in place for fresh produce manufacturers. But since this law was passed, now fresh produce producers are definitely part of the developing a plan in order to ensure the safety of their food and prevent food-borne illness. So they developed a class for those fresh produce farmers in North Carolina. Also, it addressed things like if you are growing lettuce and you have a facility that washes that lettuce and puts it into bags, that facility is a processing facility. And so it was addressed, those facilities are also addressed in FSMA. Their classes were also utilized to help there. So they were really strategic and helpful for all of the food manufacturers in North Carolina to understand and be certified and develop a plan to address the Food Safety Modernization Act and what was required of them. So we've reviewed food law. Since very early times, where we're dealing mainly with food adulteration, some level of safety, but these laws developed over time. And as times changed from rural focused to more urban focused environments, those laws had to adapt as well. And we see that up and through modern times, through the 2011 passing of FSMA. So until recently, those laws were very reactionary. FSMA is really the first law dealing with food safety that we're really looking to prevent problems, to make sure people don't get sick before, or we want to make sure that doesn't happen, right? We don't want someone getting sick initiating a recall of a food product. So our food supply changes food laws, and everybody needs to be adaptive in this process. Unfortunately, sometimes getting federal laws passed is is a vast undertaking and something that doesn't happen really quickly. So we are definitely feeling the strains of that currently in our world to date. But the law does address those changes in food safety as technology has moved forward. So this is a short one for Friday. I hope everybody enjoys some good weather this weekend. Get out, get some exercise. It'll definitely lift your spirits. I'll see you next week.